Tonight, election 2022 and the economy.
When inflation goes up and there's a prospect of a recession coming up, there's obviously a little more uncertainty.
How the midterms could be shaped by how Americans view their economic situation. Plus, the U.S. reaction to the North Korean missile launch that put Japan on high alert. And fleeing war and ending up in another war zone. See how the attacks against Ukraine are being felt throughout the region. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
Heading into the final stretch before voters head to the polls with the economy top of mind. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation. In Washington, I'm John Jessup.
And I'm Caitlin Burke. The final weeks ahead of midterm elections can sometimes be full of surprises, but it seems voters are pretty set on what's most important to them as they prepare to cast their ballots.
That's right. Economic pressures have dominated the political discourse this year, and they could end up being the deciding factor for which party walks away with control of Congress. Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us now with some new statistics that show what's exactly on voters' minds. Matt?
Well, guys, new polling suggests the economy could still be the dominating issue for the midterm elections. And with just 5 weeks to go before the big day, both parties are working on their messaging to sway voters. The Biden administration had both Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Vice President Kamala Harris at the Freedmen's Bank Forum. They were promoting equity when it comes to economic opportunity for Americans.
We know that we need to do all we can to build a fairer economy. And that's why we have put racial equity at the forefront of our agenda at Treasury.
America is a nation driven by the ambition and aspiration of her people. And so let us continue to fight to make sure all people have a chance to realize their dreams and to determine their own future.
And it's their future that Americans seem to be worrying about the most heading into the midterms. A new Monmouth poll shows 82% of Americans ranking inflation as extremely or a very important issue. Issues like crime, jobs, and immigration follow, and abortion comes in seventh with 56% seeing that issue as extremely or very important. Republicans and Democrats are trying to frame economic and social issues in their messages to voters. In Wisconsin, which could be a swing state for Senate control, the talk is dollars and cents.
Wisconsinites and Americans in general are fed up with inflation and the economy.
Inflation is the greatest concern for here.
A separate August report from Lending Club points out 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, especially with inflation. People are even more squeezed thanks to higher prices for things like groceries and housing. It's up about 5% from this time last year as inflation has hit a 40-year high. A Bank of America survey found that more than 70% of the workforce feels their pay isn't keeping up with prices. There have been reports Yellen might step down as a potential response from the Biden administration to economic woes. She denies that report.
You might leave as Treasury Secretary at some point in the near future. Any truth to that?
There is no truth to that.
Okay.
As both parties target independent voters, the Monmouth survey shows that coveted voting bloc is twice as likely to choose economic issues over social issues. That could potentially put Democrats at a disadvantage. John and Caitlin.
All right, Matt Galka reporting. Thank you so much, Matt. Well, here with us now is Joel Griffith, Research Fellow in the Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Joel, welcome. As Matt was just reporting, a 40-year high. It's probably a 40-year high with inflation. It's probably no surprise then that the economy is the leading issue for voters. Joel, with about a month until Election Day, how much can the economic situation change for Americans to actually feel any significant effect? Is there enough time?
No, the economic situation continues to deteriorate. You know, we've had 8 consecutive quarters of real incomes declining for families in this country, and that amounts to nearly a $5,000 pay cut for families on President Biden's watch. And the situation is going to worsen now as we see layoffs building, you see the number of available jobs actually beginning to decline. And when Americans look at their retirement accounts that they've been saving for many years, people are noticing that many of those retirement accounts have actually lost about 30% of their value in just the past year or so. So families are really feeling the crunch right now. And sadly, this administration continues to double down on the policies that got us in this mess in the first place.
Today's White House events promoting economic opportunity comes after Democrats passed the Inflation Reduction Act earlier this summer. What does it say about that legislation that inflation is still a significant burden to American households months later?
Well, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act would actually make inflation worse because it increases taxes on businesses and on families. It actually implements a big part of the Green New Deal, which is going to make energy not just more expensive, but also less reliable. And it costs hundreds of billions of dollars that are funded by agents that are going to be shaking down American families and also funded by yet more government borrowing. This will only make inflation worse.
Joel, we only have about a minute left. You know, Republicans are pitching their Commitment to America economic plan that prioritizes cutting government spending, increasing energy independence, and confronting China's dominance in supply chains. How do you think the GOP plan would affect the economy?
For so long as we diminish regulations and actually reduce the tax burden on Americans, that'll be a benefit. But we need to have Republicans and Democrats admit that a big part of what we're facing now with the inflation crisis is the fact that we had an economic shutdown that was unnecessary and immoral, and that both Republicans and Democrats together in Congress passed trillions of dollars worth of new spending that was financed by printing trillions of dollars at the Federal Reserve. And that is what is causing inflation right now. To stop that long term, we have to get government spending under control.
All right, Joel Griffith with the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Joel. Well, to the campaign and a critical race that would shift the Beltway's balance of power. Despite allegations Georgia Senate candidate Herschel Walker paid for a girlfriend's abortion back in 2009, both the Republican Senatorial Committee and the Senate Leadership Fund are standing by the pro-life candidate. They claim Democrats are using a news report as a distraction in the tight race against incumbent Democrat Senator Raphael Warnock. CBN News reached out to Walker's campaign today for comment and were referred to his tweet calling the allegation a, quote, flat-out lie, saying Democrats will do anything to hold power. After the allegation, Walker's son spoke out against his father, saying every family member of Herschel Walker asked him not to run for office because we all knew some of his past, adding, I don't care about someone who has a bad past and takes accountability, but how dare you lie and act as though you're some moral, Christian, upright man. The GOP candidate responded on Twitter saying he loves his son no matter what.
President Biden reaffirming U.S. commitment to Japan's defense today in a call with the country's prime minister. It comes after North Korea fired a ballistic missile over Japan, causing evacuation notices and suspending train services. That kind of nuclear-capable weapon can travel far enough to reach the U.S. territory of Guam and beyond. North Korea has been ramping up missile tests as it pushes to build a full-fledged nuclear arsenal.
Well, for more now, we turn to Michael O'Hanlon with the Brookings Institution. Michael, great to have you. No surprise here, the White House and Japan are condemning the missile launch, noting it violates United Nations Security Council resolutions. Beyond condemnation, though, Michael, what can be done?
It's an excellent question because we've almost done everything short of actually physically preventing the North Koreans from launching missiles. And if we did that, of course, if we tried to do that, we might fail. And even if we succeeded, there's no telling how they would respond. The sanctions that have been in place in a very powerful way ever since really 2017 continue to squeeze North Korea's economy mercilessly. COVID's made it even worse. And North Korea's leader doesn't seem to care because, of course, his last concern is for his own people's well-being. So even though he presides over one of the poorest countries on earth, nonetheless, he seems impervious to the sanctions. So I'm sure he's not completely impervious. You know, he's a youngish man and presumably doesn't want to live and rule over a failed state for the next several decades of his expected tenure in office. But I think that he's not going to give up nukes or missiles just for a certain number of dollars or amount of sanctions relief. So I think we're going to have to think a little more creatively about diplomacy with North Korea, keep the sanctions on, try to tighten them up where possible, but get a little more realistic, because under most American presidents, we've always said, North Korea has to get rid of all of its nuclear weapons in any deal. And that may sound principled. It may be the right long-term goal, but it's not a realistic short-term goal. And in a way, President Trump seemed to get that, but then he himself sort of fell back onto the hardline, traditional line that John Bolton and others recommended when there was a moment of opportunity, perhaps, for his diplomacy. So I just think we're going to have to get more realistic about how to deal with North Korea.
In September, North Korea passed a law declaring itself a nuclear weapons state. What's the status of their nuclear program?
They probably got 50, 60, 70 warheads. Now, not all of them are necessarily equally dependable. They've tested nuclear weapons 6 times. They're the only country on Earth that's tested in the 21st century. And they started that in 2006, did 1 under George Bush, 4 under Barack Obama, and 1 under Donald Trump. So there's plenty of bipartisan spite that North Korea directs at the United States, doesn't seem to prefer Republicans over Democrats or vice versa. And so that arsenal is probably in reasonably good shape in the sense that the sixth test was a large detonation, and therefore there's a good chance they've gone back and rebuilt whatever bombs they might have had before then to bring them up more to the standards and technology of that final test. Doesn't mean they can be delivered on a long-range missile. So even if North Korea tried to send one to the United States, they might fail, and even if they succeeded, we might intercept it with our Alaska-California missile defense system. But it does pose a serious threat, at least to South Korea and Japan, the existing arsenal.
Michael, Guam is a U.S. territory that's directly in the line of fire for North Korea. Does the United States have the ability to protect that island in the minute or so that we have left?
Yeah, I think we do, because we have a number of our missile defense systems there on Guam. And, you know, the longer range missile defense systems have had a mixed history of testing. But the short to medium range systems like THAAD and Navy theater-wide system, those have done quite well in recent testing. They could be overwhelmed by a large enough arsenal or fooled by a sophisticated adversary with a lot of decoys and whatnot, but I don't think North Korea has those capabilities. So I think we probably could defend Guam. Of course, we don't want to find out if the warhead is a nuclear weapon, because you can't afford to be wrong, but chances are that we could actually protect it.
All right, Michael Hanlon with the Brookings Institution. We always appreciate your time and insights. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you kindly. Thank you.
Bringing revolution to Iran by ending internet restrictions? How some U.S. lawmakers are hoping to do just that. Next. Unrest and protests continue across Iran, even with the government restricting internet access and limiting the flow of information.
Lawmakers here in the United States want the State Department to do more for people living in Iran, while the U.S. recently eased restrictions on internet services to counter Tehran's government censorship. Billionaire Elon Musk, the world's richest man, wants to take it one step further.
He wants to provide Iranians with Starlink, his satellite internet service. And while the satellites are now active over Iran, the signal won't be accessible until the country has portable receivers.
In Ukraine, he pushed thousands of them, but obviously we had a government to work alongside. In Iran, we don't, but there are NGOs on the ground. We have covert means through various partnerships and routes that we can get these things in.
Congressman Mike Waltz believes the U.S. government should coordinate those efforts. He and Representative Maria Salazar recently wrote to Secretary of State Antony Blinken requesting the State Department get involved.
And liftoff of Starlink 435.
I mean, this Starlink system can be an avenue for freedom and be an avenue to expose these regimes, whether it's cell phone videos being taken of their brutality or just people's message to their loved ones around the world that's trying to get out. I think we have a moral responsibility to help get these receivers in so that they can link up with the satellites and get these messages out.
The receivers would allow users to bypass firewalls put in place by the Iranian government and connect directly to satellite internet. Musk himself has warned, however, that there's significant risk involved. The signal can be easily tracked, which means Iran's security forces could locate users, shut them down, and arrest them.
Still,
they are taking risks not to just themselves, but to their entire families, because these regimes crack down not just on the person daring to speak out, but their family, their village, their entire tribe. They're still willing to take those risks, and they're willing to fight for their freedom.
The U.S. will agree to facilitate this public-private partnership, but worries the Biden administration may not want to rock the boat with the Islamic regime in order to complete a new Iran nuclear deal.
Russians fleeing their own country to dodge a military draft to fight in Ukraine. Where they're going when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. Ukrainian forces gaining ground in the eastern part of the country as troops there make a concerted push against the Russian invasion. In recent days, Ukraine reclaimed the northern Donetsk town of Liman, just days after Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed to illegally annex it. Ukraine says the counteroffensive isn't over. Overnight, President Volodymyr Zelensky said though the fierce fighting continues, Russia made a mistake by invading Ukraine and going to war. Well, meanwhile, airports across Russia are packed with young men fleeing for fear of being drafted into the war, many ending up in Armenia.
It's a Christian nation that Russia typically protects from its Muslim neighbors. But the Kremlin's military failures in Ukraine have left their allies vulnerable. And as CBN News contributor Chuck Holton reports, Armenia is now looking for support from the West.
Russia's disastrous campaign in Ukraine is making waves back at home, and the recent call-up of another 300,000 troops has sparked a national rush for the exits, adding to the hundreds of thousands of mostly men who have already fled since the war began. Russia has always been one of Armenia's most important allies, although that relationship has turned awkward since the invasion of Ukraine. Armenia is now being flooded daily by Russians in the thousands, entering on one-way tickets. CBN spoke with some of them about the conflict earlier this year.
Yeah, they are against the war. Everyone that I'm talking with, they saying they against the war.
Even if the war ends and Russia loses, I don't see myself living comfortably in a country where the country leader is almost like a Hitler, and the absolutely militaristic state of the government right now is awful.
There are Russians all over here in downtown Yerevan, and I've been talking to many of them. It seems like most are young professionals, IT people, things like that, people who do their work online, and that's something that you really can't do right now in Russia because of the sanctions. Also, everybody that I've spoken to has been vehemently against this war, but there's a catch. They don't want to go on camera and talk about it. That says a lot about how much they fear their own government, because most of them still have families back in Russia. As Russian power appears to crumble, many former Soviet countries are jockeying for stature and position to possibly benefit from a weaker Russia. And Armenia sits squarely in the middle of this political power play, including Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkey. Azerbaijan recently launched multiple attacks on its neighbor, killing more than 200 Armenian military and civilians in the latest flare-up of an ongoing conflict over territory. When that happened, Armenia appealed to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Russia's version of NATO, but help did not arrive.
The world doesn't help us, but we shouldn't be offended, because we have locked ourselves in the chains of the CSTO, which sits on our neck. We have no right to ask for any help from the world. When we are free from this CSTO and from the Russian shackles, then the entire world can step up on our side.
We have all witnessed Russia's failures in Ukraine. We've seen what happened in the Kharkiv front, and Russia's military capabilities have actually dwindled a lot in the last month. So Russia is not interested in confronting neither Azerbaijan nor Turkey because it doesn't have capabilities.
I am a refugee from Russia. I was persecuted for political reasons. I came to escape one war and ended up in another one. I can't escape it. I want this to stop as soon as possible. The CSTO must do something or it may as well not exist.
September 17th, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi traveled to Armenia and condemned the Azeri aggression, which concerns more than 1 million Armenians living in her home state of California.
The U.S. plays a stabilizing role. The U.S. actually managed to broke a ceasefire on the 15th of September.
In my latest calls with both Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Aliyev, both leaders told me that they are ready for peace.
Active in its communications with Baku and President Aliyev, urging him not to escalate, urging him to disengage its forces from the sovereign territory of Armenia. So the only hope is on the Americans that they will somehow put some diplomatic and political pressure on the Aliyev regime and will stop this aggression from becoming or from turning into a large-scale war.
Armenians were very grateful for the attention from the West, with many calling for deeper cooperation.
If the United States is interested in having some sort of presence in the South Caucasus, and I'm absolutely sure Washington is interested in that, it should pressure both Turkey and Azerbaijan, who are actively cooperating with Russia, and push them towards a more constructive stance towards Armenia.
For CBN News, I'm Chuck Holton.
Coming up, taking matters into their own hands. How victims are helping victims after Hurricane Ian when we come back.
Young people, millennials, are flocking to church.
It's not an exaggeration to say that we love to meet them and that we love to know their stories.
Well, finally tonight, in the wake of Hurricane Ian, it's been all hands on deck.
That's especially true in Pine Island, Florida, where the storm knocked out the only bridge on or off the island. Hundreds there were cut off from the mainland, trapped in their homes without electricity and clean water. But volunteers have been taking to the water, bringing supplies and shuttling residents by boat, kayak, and jet ski. Both those being rescued and those doing the rescuing say it's encouraging to see the community coming together.
Caitlin, you and I have both covered hurricanes and their aftermath. It's always tragic to see the destruction and loss of life, but always inspiring to see people come together and help each other out.
Yes, good news, much needed in such a heavy time.
That's right. Thanks for watching.
We'll see you tomorrow.